Good afternoon, everybody. I will call the Economic Development Task Force meeting to order. I'd first like to recognize that we are on the territory of the Nanaimo First Nations. So first, are there any introduction of late items?
None from staff.
Okay. So adoption of agenda as it reads. Doug? And Jim? Thank you. And all those in favor? Thank you. Adoption of the agenda?
Of the minutes?
Sorry. I did the agenda, didn't I? Adoption of the minutes.
There's one change, and that's just to correct typos just in the present section where it says alternative, just to change it to alternate. So we'll make that correction.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Adoption of the minutes? Doug? And Jim, second? All those in favor? Thank you. So first we have the reports and a summary of the focus group sessions. Bill Corson will introduce it, and these are the group sessions that took place on June 17th.
Great, thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. The main focus of today's meeting is really for Alan Nielsen to take us through the report he circulated to us on the external agency. The purpose of these presentations we've included in your agenda package are just to give you a bit of a summary of the information that we were able to obtain through the focus groups last Wednesday, and then from the scenario planning session most of you were at that we had on Thursday. And I'm happy to go through all these with the group, but I'm also happy just to defer things to Mr. Nielsen as well. So I'm happy to take direction from the group depending on what you would like. Would you like me to kind of quickly summarize things?
Any feedback from anybody if you want to quickly review these, or?
No, I already read it.
You already read it?
Yes.
Nobody else? Everybody says they've read it? Okay.
That makes it easy. Okay. So then it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Nielsen, who's going to take us through a session for the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Shall I begin?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks very much to the committee. Thanks, Mr. Corson, for the introduction. So, the committee will remember that pre-COVID we met and talked a little bit about what the task force or what the committee was doing with, I guess it's a task force, I beg your pardon, what the task force is doing with respect to the implementation of the report that was submitted to council a few months back with respect to the economic development function, and in particular the idea of having a new approach, a new model or governance model and service delivery model. And look, I'm going to just kick in if I could and just go through some of these slides just to give a little bit of context, and then also to kind of jump right into the draft charter if I could. Will that reach from here, do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Okay. We're going to balance here.
It's all right.
Okay, so let me just outline briefly just the presentation here. So I'll start with a brief recap of work to date, and then move into some of the success factors for the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. And you'll recall that when we met last time in February, we talked a little bit as a task force about different factors that would be important for the task force to see in terms of making this agency successful. And also informing those success factors was the research that was done for the report earlier. The main event's going to be kind of the review of the draft charter, a copy of which I hope folks have in front of them, but I'll be going through that anyway. And then finally, talk a bit about next steps moving forward. Madam Chair, when we look at work to date, just a recap for task force members. Thank you very much. Oh, we'll try that again. Okay, excuse me 1 second.
Musical technology.
Okay, there we go. Woo. All right. So we've got, just in terms of the work to date, then just to remind task force members so that we're all on the same page, as it were. The city, about a year ago, in fact, maybe a little, last summer at least, the city set out to enhance the economic development function. That was a priority the council had set. It wanted to add resources to the function and also to look at the model through which the function was delivered as a service. So wanted to consider the enhanced service function in terms of two different factors. The first, I think you just jinxed us, Bill.
Uh-oh. Killed it. Clicking the presentation.
Oh, maybe just go into the presentation. Maybe click the. There we go. Okay, so wanted to consider the enhanced function in terms of two different elements. First is the scope of the services, kind of the what, and then the second is the preferred service model, or how we're going to deliver those services, that scope of services. So the scope, as I mentioned, addresses really the question of what should be provided by the city in terms of economic development, and then the how services are delivered and by whom we got to a little bit later. When we looked at the scope, and again, this is all just by way of recapping and refreshing our memories, when we looked at the scope, we kind of identified 7 or 8 different elements that were going to be important to deliver through the economic development function. So really, these items then make up the function or define the function. The first is the development of an economic development strategy. The second is what we've termed economic reporting. So that's all the statistics that we collect from time to time to kind of talk about how the economy is doing. A third then is navigating City Hall. One of the points that was made in the, there we go. Oh, we got it.
Sorry,
That's all right.
I think that one is Cal.
Okay, perfect. When we look at navigating City Hall, then one of the items or one of the pieces of information that are findings that came out of the original report was the reality, really, the observation that a lot of decisions that affect economic development and the ability of the city to help develop the economy, really those decisions take place within City Hall. So any function then that focuses on economic development has to look at how the decisions are made within City Hall and helping business people and others navigate through City Hall. Service contract management. So right now we do have different contracts in place under kind of a broader economic development framework, and so we assigned this item as to the scope of the economic development function. Policy input. How do we ensure that the proper economic focus is part, or lens, if you will, is part of the thinking that goes on in the city and in other agencies across the city in terms of making policy. Coordination of efforts. You'll recall from the report that we spent a fair bit of time looking at all the different agencies that are active in Nanaimo in different capacities. And we wanted to identify what those agencies did in particular, and then we assigned as a part of the function the coordination of those efforts, which is something that is fairly typical in most economic development services. And then a key one, business attraction. When we look at economic development, we look kind of at like business retention, business enhancement, and then business attraction. And as we went through our survey of the different agencies that were in town and the different things that they do, we found there was a lot of effort spent already or devoted already to retaining businesses and helping those businesses grow. And what we really wanted to focus on for this new function was going to be the business attraction efforts. Now, when we looked at the service model then, we wanted to address questions of how the services that make up the function, the ones we just talked about, are delivered. And we also wanted to talk about by whom. So that kind of gets to gets us closer to the model that we're looking at and that we fleshed out and we'll go through today. 5 different models, you'll recall, were considered. We looked at an in-house delivery model. We looked at a city-owned agency. We looked at the service contract model, which is kind of an exterior to the city, but an independent contractor who would provide the service on behalf of the city. And then we looked at 2 hybrid approaches, one that would mix elements of the in-house and the city-owned agency, and another that would mix elements of the in-house and the service contract. Recommendations coming out of the report, you'll recall, first of all, the council endorsed an initial scope of services for the function that includes economic development strategy, economic reporting, navigating City Hall, service contract management, policy input, coordination of efforts, and business attraction. That was the first recommendation that was provided and the council endorsed. The second recommendation was the council endorsed the in-house city-owned agency hybrid model to deliver the function. And the council divide the scope of the services between these 2 agencies. We have the in-house city staff economic development group, which would do certain things, and that's laid out in the report. And then we have the arm's length Nanaimo Prosperity Agency, owned primarily by the city, run by its own board and staff. You'll recall also then the council, a recommendation was put forward, the council established a steering committee or this task force to do 2 different things. First, to oversee the creation of the Nanaimo Economic Development Strategy, and then second, and more specific to our function here today, to fully develop the ownership, funding, governance, staffing, and other elements of the city-owned Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. So that kind of brought us from a year ago up to the present. And let's move on now and kind of talk a little bit about what it is we're here today to focus on. Really to develop a charter for the new city-owned Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. We started that work in February, as I mentioned, pre-COVID. We've now come back to kind of look at some more information and to give some thought to collectively to what's in front of us and how we want to proceed. When we talk about a charter, we're really talking about kind of a fundamental document that sets out all of the different elements of what this agency needs in order to fulfill its purpose and in order to function properly and make decisions properly. We could call it something else. We've chosen arbitrarily to call it kind of a charter. A charter is we'll treat it with air quotes in the sense it's probably not an official document, but it's going to inform official documents that follow, like articles of incorporation, shareholders agreement if we need them, those kinds of things. But the charter really does set out, I think, the key elements, and we'll go through that and I'll let the task force decide. So before we get to the actual text, let's just talk about the success factors that we identified both in the report and then more importantly at the discussion that we had in February with the task force. You'll recall that well, first of all, what factors are critical to the agency's success and should inform and be reflected in the charter? So a few different things came up, and I'll just remind folks of these different things. First was focus. So we want to ensure that we have a clear purpose, a clear focus. We've set that out already in terms of the report, in terms of identifying what the scope of services would be for this particular agency, and we want to make sure that our charter, which really gives life to the agency, reflects that clear focus. Autonomy, we want to, and when I say we, this is something that we heard not only through our stakeholder input or consultation in the report, but also then from the task force members last day. Hopefully you'll recall that we had some good discussion and some flip charts going on and looked at some different ideas and and you gave a lot of input on these items. Oops, we've got someone else in the waiting room there. There we go. Okay, so when we look at another key element, another key success factor then is autonomy. And here we're talking specifically about the legal authorities. So we heard from the task force, we heard from the community that we want to have a separate body with legal authority. That means kind of a corporation, what we've called an agency. We want to have inclusivity as it relates in particular to owners and stakeholders. This is something that we're going to come back to a little bit later as we go through the draft charter, because we've really focused on the notion of having more than one owner in here. We'll get to that in a moment. We wanted to have a hybrid board. We recognized that it's important that the community and key agencies in the community be represented on the board, but we also recognize that when we have a specialist agency like this, we want to make sure that our board incorporates into it different skill sets and backgrounds. So we wanted to be able, to the extent possible, to try to get the best of both worlds, have a little bit of representation of key players in town, but also have folks on there who have the different skill sets we need to run this agency properly and make decisions for the agency. I talked about inclusivity earlier in terms of ownership of the corporation, but we also talked about inclusivity at our last meeting in terms of governance, that is decision-making, or more specifically, the board and the makeup of the board of the new agency. So we'll get to that in a moment as we go through the charter, but the idea of having, again, some mechanism to ensure that we get different parts of the community represented in our board governance. We talked also about autonomy in terms of governance. So we want to have a body that has a fairly high level of autonomy from the owners in its ability to make decisions. Transparency, important. We heard from the task force last time that it's very important that the agency be transparent in its decisions and its actions. Consensus-based, when we talked about governance and how we wanted to kind of think about voting, there was a clear sense among task force members that we want, whenever possible, to encourage consensus-based. And really, if the agency is working well and the board is working well together, you're going to have consensus in most cases. Voting is kind of there for the tricky issues that hopefully will be few and far between. Accountability, very important to have accountability, because at the end of the day, even though we're going to have an independent corporation and even though we're going to have an autonomous board, at the end of the day, we do have public funds being used for this. So there is an accountability back to the city, and that's very important to establish and to ensure that we have mechanisms in place to strengthen that. Cost effectiveness. So we talked about corporate services, and we talked about the need to, first of all, ensure that we've got an independent group, but also to be pragmatic and cost effective in how we provide some corporate services, the HR, the legal, the finance and accounting to that body, so that we're not wasting money, really. We're using resources that exist elsewhere, particularly at the city where we can. Nimbleness, we heard, as a success factor from the task force and also through the research for the report, the need for the board and staff to be nimble. And really, that's a bit of a euphemism for outside of City Hall, if I can say that. No offense to my City Hall colleagues here. Semi-autonomy for funding. This one's kind of interesting because we did say, notwithstanding the idea that we want autonomy in terms of legal structure and autonomy in terms of decision-making or governance, we do recognize that this agency at the end of the day is going to be primarily funded by using public dollars. So there will be other sources of funding, but there'll be a reliance on public dollars as well. So semi-autonomous in terms of funding. And then finally, collaborative with the city and with partners. That was a key success factor. And Madam Chair, I'll just introduce this slide and then pause and ask if there's any feedback at this point before we move on. But really, then using those success factors, we built a draft charter. And allow me to apologize first to task force members for not getting it to you with a little bit more heads up time to review, but we'll go through that in some detail today. But we've got the draft charter for the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency, created to capture all of the elements we just talked about, all of the success factors, and we'll go through and get your feedback and some direction on that. Madam Chair, let me just pass it back to you, if I may, and just see if there's any input or any questions that I can answer.
Thank you. So can we switch it back to Zoom? Does anybody here have any questions first?
I think I might have some questions when we go through it.
Sure.
Okay. So before we go on, does anybody have any questions about what Mr. Nielsen said today? Don't see any hands.
You're done.
What's that?
You're done, you go home.
Okay, yes. No, now we're getting into the good stuff.
Now we'll get into where there's questions.
Okay. Shall we proceed, Madam Chair, then?
Yes.
Okay. So you will have in front of you a document titled Nanaimo Prosperity Agency Draft Charter, and the big title there is the Shared Ownership Version. So let me just kind of start by explaining that. So we have one of the key items, and I referred to this point already under the success factors, but one of the key items that came out of the research and came from our task force discussion last day was the notion that for the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency to be successful in what it sets out to do, there needs to be shared buy-in, if you will, or broad buy-in for the community and broad inclusivity or inclusion of the community. And it was one idea that came up, certainly it was very loud and clear in the interviews for the report, and we talked about it a little bit at the task force as well, was the notion that different players, in order to ensure that we have that buy-in, different players needed to be at the table, not only in a governance capacity or on committees, but also in terms of investment in the agency. A share of ownership in some cases, and some believe that a share of ownership was the best way to do that. So what we've done here is structured a charter that kind of is one option that assumes that we would have, or that sets out some mechanisms for actually allowing different agencies to own shares along with the city in this endeavor. I will pause just for 1 minute to mention that last day we left the meeting with a few questions, and one of the directions from the task force was to follow up on some of those questions. And following up on those questions involved speaking with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs in their group, which deals with local government corporations. I don't know if you recall, but at our last meeting, some task force members had asked some questions around the authority of the agency to make certain decisions, to borrow funds, to do all those kinds of things, to allow other shareholders to own shares in it. I can report that I did speak with the ministry. I met with them, and happily, everything that was kind of set out and everything that's set out here is fine in terms, it is within bounds, in other words. The ministry accepts the position and understands the position that there may be a desire among stakeholders to have the city be the primary owner, but not the sole owner, and that the city or that the agency will look to do, thank you very much, will look to do different things that normally we would have a municipality do, but in this case we can still do, for example, borrow funds, make final decisions, approve its own budget, those kinds of things as a corporation. And all of those points really speak to the fact as well that when we look at a corporation, we're very much talking about an independent, autonomous body, which is different than a committee, which is different than a task force, which very much relies on the city government to make final decisions and give final directions. The city government in this case would be an owner and would have certain rights as an owner, but the corporation would operate with quite a bit of autonomy in that sense. I did as well, since our last meeting, have a meeting in Calgary with the, I was there for other business, so it's not on this contract. I did have a meeting as well with the Calgary Economic Development Corporation, just to kind of get a sense of their success factors and how they've kind of modeled. So some of that, the feedback from that, and bounced off a few of the questions that came up at the last task force meeting with Calgary Economic Development. So just throw that out there just to give you a sense that some of the information here is informed a little bit by the responses I got from Calgary as well. Okay, let's move on if we could. So when we look at the first page, I'm just going to go right through if I could and just walk everybody through, and I'll pause at different times, or if you shout out or put your hand up, and I'll try to make sure that we pause for questions when you have them. First, the name, Nanaimo Prosperity Agency Incorporated. So right away we see incorporated, it is incorporated, it is a separate legal body, so that's important. Purpose, the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency is the economic development body through which business, government, First Nations, and community partners collaborate to build Nanaimo's economy and increase the level of shared prosperity enjoyed by those who live here. Tried to capture that based on some information that was put forward in the final report that went to council on the structure, and also to kind of get a sense just from what we had talked about at our earlier meeting. Mandate. So the mandate kind of comes right from the service that I mentioned earlier, the scope of services, and in particular the items that would be assigned under the service model to the agency. So first, to implement, maintain, and update as required the Nanaimo Economic Development Strategy. Now, I know the task force is responsible for creating the strategy, but then once it's created, this body would kind of take it from there, as it were. Two is to coordinate the sector-specific and other economic development activities undertaken by a range of stakeholder organizations. When we look at these kinds of corporations and other places where they exist and where they've been successful, we see there's quite a bit of focus on that role as a coordinator of bringing together different activities and efforts of different agencies. And then third, to develop and directly undertake initiatives aimed at attracting businesses, employers, talent, and investment to the community. I'll stop at the end of every page if that's all right, Madam Chair, and then we can pause there. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
No, I haven't either, so I'm keeping an eye out there. So, okay, legal structure. So the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency is a City of Nanaimo local government corporation created pursuant to Section 185 of the Community Charter. So that's the authority that Nanaimo City Council has to create it. The actual incorporation of the agency, however, is under the Business Corporations Act. And I've noted here that we also have the Income Tax Act of Canada, and under that act, we qualify on according to this charter at least, as a non-profit corporation in the sense that it's exempted from paying taxes. Now, the city and its partners could choose to make it a profit-based enterprise and actually bring in dividends. I don't think that's the intention of this particular enterprise, so I've suggested it's a non-profit undertaking. And that's not inconsistent, by the way, with other places that have these models. Yes, please.
I have a question. If we registered as a non-profit corporation and then down the line you wanted to change, is that?
Absolutely. The government will always be happy to take your taxes. Yes. Yeah, so that could change at some point if the group wanted to change the mandate to make it more of a business enterprise, it could do that. And that's a perfect segue into kind of some of the members, because who would be the ones for deciding this. Now, here's where we kind of get into some of the differences under this particular version. So let me jump in here. So when we look at members, so the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency is jointly owned by the City of Nanaimo, and recall that we talked about at the task force and in the report that the city would be the primary owner of this agency. So jointly owned by the City of Nanaimo and 5 other governments and organizations, including Nanaimo Chamber of Commerce, Nanaimo Airport Commission, Nanaimo Port Authority, Sunamic First Nation, Vancouver Island University. Now, those 5 I identified. Those are Alan Nielsen's kind of entries there. So I don't mean to presume that you're all on board with this or that this is the definitive list. I wanted simply to kind of put it there for discussion purposes. But I'll move on if I could, and we'll come back to that in a moment. All 6 partner organizations, including the city, are designated as members in the agency's articles of incorporation. I'll just come to the end of this little bit here. The City of Nanaimo, as the lead member, holds 1 Class A share in the agency. Each of the other members holds 1 Class B share. All Class A and Class B shares are without par value. And there's kind of method here to the madness of having 2 classes of shares, which I'll come to in a moment. But let me pause there, and I'll just see if there's any hands. Sorry, Madam Chair, I don't mean to usurp your role. Oh.
I thank you for the help because I can't see from that screen. So, Councillor Turley, and you'll need to unmute. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. The question I have is around the legal structure. At some point in time, the agency decided to go the route of a for-profit agency. I'm wondering, I believe under the community charter, the city would not be able to provide funding for said agency if it's a for-profit as opposed to non-profit. That might be, we might want to confirm that, or at the point in time when we decide to make a decision like that.
Thank you very much. Through the chair, if I may, to Councillor Turley, thank you very much for the question. I will certainly confirm that. I know that in one municipality, we looked at, actually with 2 municipalities, looked at creating a corporation that our lawyers told us we should make a for-profit because we anticipated some dividends, and that one relied almost entirely on public funding, but it's a good flag to raise, so I'll be sure to kind of check into that. And as you suggest, it's kind of for the future reference if it decided to go that way, but it's good to know that for sure. Shall I move on, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I have a question? Some of these agencies have jurisdiction outside of city boundaries. Can you comment on that?
Well, that's
That's a very good point.
Yes, some of them do have jurisdictions outside the city boundaries. Some of them are within, but I think actually most of them probably are without. Even the Nanaimo Chamber of Commerce is. So it is. I think ultimately, and we talked about this when we wrote the report. I think that ultimately it would be nice from an economic development perspective to have a broader service area, because we're a little bit the political boundaries are a little bit artificial in terms of economy. And so ultimately, the powers that be, and whenever this occurs, may want to kind of look at expanding the service area to include those others. In the meantime, I guess I would say that, well, these groups are big players in Nanaimo itself. The fact that they have operations outside of Nanaimo, I'm not sure that's a showstopper. I think we're going to be hard pressed to find agencies with a big economic impact that are limited only to the city, other than the city.
Okay.
Mr. Madam Chair, just thinking, the Regional District of Nanaimo recently completed their review of economic development and how they were going to deliver it. And the recommendation that came back, or I think the motion was passed, was that they were not going to provide any funding towards economic development at this point in time. But historically, the electoral areas around the city did pay into NEDC. So depending on what model we pick, this could be an interesting approach to go back to the RDN and have that discussion as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kathy?
Madam Chair, thank you. I'm just wondering if you can review what is the rationale for the 6 partners. I understand the city, but the other 5, if you could just briefly go over those.
Sure. So the thinking there was, and there are 2 kind of questions there. One is the rationale for having any other owners, and then the second question is these 5 in particular. So just with respect to the first question, we'll kind of get into that a little bit more in a moment, but the gist of it is, I think that I tried to identify a way to reflect and to honor what we had heard in the report, and also a little bit of the task force on having broader buy-in to the agency and having kind of people at the stake. I think the colloquial term was, skin in the game. People at the stake with stakes at the table, and some actual investment in the agency, so that we would be have more of a broader community endeavor. Now, with respect to why these 5 in particular, my thinking again, and the caveat here being this is just me kind of putting these forward for discussion, but my thinking there was to pick agencies that were large enough to have a big impact on the economy, but also were somewhat neutral, I suppose. So with the exception of the Chamber of Commerce, I tried to stay away from different associations or interest groups, and to kind of really focus on ones that had a broader, slightly public interest mandate, as well as a big kind of role in the economy. So it's not a perfect list, I'm sure, and that was simply my thinking behind it.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
if I could, Madam Chair, so as opposed to the city being the sole owner and these other groups being potentially represented on the board, you felt it was better interest to the success of this that all of these groups participate, rather than just the cities being the sole owner.
Well, that is did I feel that? I think that there's a case to be made for that. I think there's an argument to be made for that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the task force that will decide. And so that's why I wanted to stress that we're looking here at the shareholder, the shared ownership version. I'm going to talk in a minute about what the other version would look like that didn't have them.
Okay.
But you've prompted a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I have Jason. Muted.
Oh,
No?
hang on, let me mute and then unmute you.
Now it's muted. Unmute.
Okay, now try.
Oh, but he has a
Unmute as well.
Unmute yours, Jason, see what happens.
Here. Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Oh.
Hey, pop into Ian's office.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
Anybody else? that
He's
has-
just going to Ian's
Oh,
office.
he's going, okay. Oh,
There we go. Okay, Ian, you got to unmute now.
Overarching.
There we go. Okay, we got it.
entity.
Okay, we got you.
okay. Jason,
Why, I think one of the questions we had, I think you mentioned earlier, there'd be another version of this, but a board of directors typically having control wouldn't be uncommon, and then having another agency on top of that overarching it, but wouldn't it be better just to have a single board of directors with the community, or is that the other version that you're looking at?
So, thank you for the question. It's a very good question because it helps us to kind of clarify a couple of things. What we're looking at here is simple. So, when we look at any corporation, we have an owner and we have decision makers. Sometimes they're the same body. In this kind of corporation, we're going to have the shareholders who own the company, and then we're going to have a board of directors. If we didn't have any other agencies, if it was wholly city-owned, we would have the city as the sole member. And the city, as the shareholder, as the owner, would still have certain decisions to make in certain instances. So we would try we always want to try to delegate as much authority as possible to the board of directors, which is in place to govern the agency. But the owner of the agency still, at the end of the day, has certain rights and certain decisions that it needs to make under the Business Corporations Act and whatever other decisions we want it to make. Under this particular model, we've simply kind of said, well, rather than having one owner, we're going to have 6 owners. So those 6 owners collectively, as the owners, would still be required to make certain decisions that the board's not legally able to, or that we choose not to give it the ability to make. So it's not actually a separate kind of agency on top of the board. They're all part of the same agency. But what we're trying to show here is simply that the owners do have the obligation to make certain decisions themselves, even though most of the work's going to be done by the board. So,
Ian. You're muted.
Sorry, I am.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry about that. I sort of took a look at this, going through it and went through it a little bit. I can't say I'm enthralled by the setup on this one, to be honest. And I don't think the Port Authority would be able to participate in that sort of structure. At the same time, I think there's a lot of good stuff in this document, so, more than willing to discuss how we can move it forward, but that's sort of where we're at, just so everybody knows up front here.
almost there.
And Bob. Did Bob have his hand up? Yep.
Yep, I think, hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
So, first of all, Alan, thank you very much for the outline and the presentation, and I would like to, I guess, add my voice to what a good plan this is to have multiple shareholders. And I think much of that comes from an earlier discussion that we collectively had, trying to make a durable organization to avoid what's happened in the past, where any one participant could basically dissolve the organization, and that we would then end up losing all of that momentum and collective knowledge and have to start all over again. So that's the position we find ourselves in today. And by having multiple shareholders, if we're careful about the structure, my hope would be that we provide an organization that's got durability and can move forward. And this plan looks like that provides it. So I applaud what you've created, Alan.
Thank you. Oh, there's
Andre.
Yes, thanks. I do like where this is headed. Now, in terms of the rights between Class A and Class B, and to touch on what Bob just said, what happens if Class A decides to dissolve? Do they have that right? or is it just a funding right? So to dissolve the organization, who has that authority? Is it A, B, or both?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Okay, that's a great question.
Okay.
Thank you. Let me. That's a great question, and it's a perfect segue to our next little bit here. And I'll just mention as I start talking about this that thank you to Ian for his comment, and I think his comment underscores my earlier point that it's a little presumptuous for me to put agencies down here. So my apologies, but it did succeed in provoking discussion. So that's good. Now moving on, if I could, and kind of getting to Andre's question. So when we And I'm going to move down to member decisions, and I'll try to explain the reasoning behind. The Class A and the Class B and how we've set that out. And we come back to it a little bit further when we get to funding. So when we look at key decisions, first of all, related to the mandate, governance, expansion, funding, membership, and dissolution of the agency are made by the members. So, and this kind of goes back to Jason's point. We don't want the board to have the ability, and I think the Business Corporations Act actually precludes this, but we don't want the board to have the ability to make a decision to dissolve the agency or to make a decision to change its own structure. Like, that's the purview of the owners. They get to decide what the structure of the board is and those kinds of things. And the owners get to appoint members to the board. So when we look at then the different kinds of decisions that the owners, what we refer to as members, would be able to make, first of all, the first kind of bullet there or arrow there, all members, so that's both Class A and Class B shareholders, participate in and receive one vote on decisions related to the purpose and mandate. And that speaks to Bob's point earlier, and I I apologize for using first names. I hope we're okay with the informality. But that speaks to Bob's point earlier, where if all shareholders are involved in determining and making decisions around kind of what the purpose and the mandate is of the organization, of the agency, then no one member can arbitrarily change that. So that's kind of the intention there. The composition and authority of and the method of appointment to the board of directors. Again, putting the authority over how many directors we have, what the composition of that is, the appointment of those directors into that collective ownership group. The appointment of individual directors to the board. You can't have the board appoint its own members, so that's something that the members do. And they would do that at an annual general meeting, as most corporations do. The agency's funding model, including changes to cost-sharing arrangements that support the work of the agency. So again, this is something that the group would collectively determine, the group of members, of owners. And then finally, the inclusion of additional Class B shareholders members. So if they wanted to involve other agencies in Nanaimo as owners, then this group of existing owners would determine to do that or not to do that. And then I've noted that decisions on these matters require a simple majority of members present. Now, so that kind of is interesting because all of that whole section I've just kind of referred to tries to kind of say, or what it says is, in essence, is that we've got 6 owners, including the city, that make certain decisions for the agency, on the shape of the agency, on what it does, and those kinds of things. The city, however, as the primary body, the primary owner, the city has certain rights that other shareholders don't have. And that's important because the city is the key funder, because we're using public funds. And so we need to have certain controls with the city. And what we've identified here is that the city, as the sole Class A shareholder, would make decisions related to the borrowing of monies by or on behalf of the agency. So the city, at the end of the day, is going to be the biggest guarantor of the agency. So it gets to approve borrowings on behalf of or by the agency. And by the way, the agency wouldn't be anticipated to borrow money, or in any big way at least. It's not going to be a capital agency or capital intensive. It's going to be more an operational body. Any change to the agency's nonprofit status, and that is simply kind of put in, as was mentioned earlier by one of our members, about the concern of, I think Jim mentioned it, Councillor Turley, the concern about whether the community charter precludes us from moving the status there. The inclusion of additional Class A shareholders, so that is Class A being the one that has particular authorities. And then finally, this one's key, the dissolution of the agency. So the city, as the primary funder, would be the only body that could say, we're dissolving the agency. And that's important to have that ability with the city, because if the city, at the end of the day, realizes that for whatever reason it's not working, the city needs to be able, as the body that holds public funds, needs to be able to pull the plug on that. Of course, it wouldn't get to that point without tremendous amount of discussion, I hope, but anyway. Madam Chair, we've got Jim. Oh, no, right here, down to the, in live.
Oh. Thank you, that's done.
I put my hand up at that point because I think it is the key point, and it's what Bob pointed to as well. I think that this doesn't quite do what it says it's going to do, and we can take the basket of rights, which relates to borrowing and ongoing running in one, and deal only with that idea of dissolution. And we have to imagine this thing on its worst day, because we know, everybody who's involved here knows what the worst day looks like. If the single agency can take a decision to dissolve the Prosperity Agency, why are we bothering with a joint ownership model anyway?
Well, it's a good, my thinking behind this, and this is all, again, for discussion. This is not etched in stone, so it's a good question. My thinking behind that is that the city, as the body, which as we get a little bit later, would provide 85% of the funding, needs to have that right over and above at the shareholders. If the task force thinks differently and council agrees with that, then that is, by all means, that's a doable thing.
So, well, I think it either has to be the city something less than 50%, so that agency on its own can't dissolve it.
Yep.
Or we should recognize that they have paid for and are accountable for and should have that right.
Yep.
And then we can deal with the broadness of including the port, including the airport at the board level.
Exactly, yep.
They don't have to be owners in order to have that impact. In fact, and I just think
well, and I think you've touched on the key.
I think we have to be honest about what we're trying to achieve and make sure that we build into the Constitution within those objectives.
Yeah, I would mention, Madam Chair, that in my view, the dissolution of the agency is a bit of the nuclear option. It's kind of like when all else has failed, we need to pull the plug. Yeah, exactly. And I think the city, in my submission, the city as the agency that is kind of putting the public dollars forward is the one that would have the right to do that.
I don't dispute that.
Okay.
If I may add, I like the idea, though, of the all members participating in the purpose, the mandate, and composition. Like there's inclusivity there, right? That the final decision, if we wanted to because we've got the most money in the game and the most investment in it, I think those bigger decisions, but I am hopeful that wouldn't be what we were going to, but that we would have input from the other organizations in the way that it was being run. Yeah.
But I have been hopeful in the past too. All of the collaboration can happen at the board level. The 9 directors can include the port, can include the VIU, and those people can do the collaboration, do all of that stuff. But they can't dissolve the agency. If we want to get to a point where the city is not able to dissolve it on their own, then we need to face that head on, which means a 49%, 45, whatever it is, % ownership stake. And we have to build everything around that idea. So I think it's fundamental before we start talking about what the board's going to do.
Okay. Well, if I may, Madam Chair, on that note, so my sense from speaking with the ministry folks is that this agency is going to need to be more than 49% owned, like majority owned by the city.
So the only thing I'm picking away at is if it's going to be a majority owner, why isn't it 100% owner? What's the advantage we get out of an 85% situation?
Sure. Well, I think it is, and I think Bob talked about it earlier. Bob alluded to it earlier, referred to it earlier when he said that and certainly we kind of identified it in our consultations, was the idea that even if it is 15% in total, that some kind of buy-in in the ownership of it was deemed by others to be important. But this is one model. The other model would say purely, and this maybe is picking up on Ian's point, would say simply, we've got one owner, City of Nanaimo. We're going to get inclusivity, or we're going to get inclusion and sharing of authority and decision-making authority at the board level. And we're going to get investment of funds through other mechanisms. And there's lots of mechanisms out there, and we'll come to that when we talk about the funding model. So that is, but you're absolutely right, that is the key question. I don't think it actually, and I think it's something that would be great to kind of settle today, but also I think we can talk about the board and kind of park that for a moment and come back to it in an hour or a little bit if we go through the board. But I think that is kind of the key question for sure.
Alan?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I was just trying to think through this a little bit, because we kind of want and need our cake and eat it too. And I think everybody kind of agrees with that. So I'm just wondering about some checks and balances or an exit strategy. You always have to know how this could end, and not the nuclear option. But is there some way to either have a companion document to this, or something that would put it in terms of the time frame? So this is for the purposes of 5 years.
Absolutely.
This would, or something like that. That would give all the openness or autonomy for that period, but then would provide some certainty around there will be a check in this at some point in time. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but it just strikes me as one way to kind of temporarily.
So the city would not be able to dissolve it within that 5 years.
Yeah, some certainty and autonomy, at the same time provide the accountability piece that if things change, and for public side, you may find it desirable through a different council or whatever, there's a mechanism to, this isn't in perpetuity, because I don't think anything's in perpetuity.
Absolutely.
So, sort of make a time frame, and then maybe you can, I don't know, I'm just trying to find a way to kind of have it both ways.
Okay, I've got Kathy, and then Andre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just some further questions. I guess it's about the mandate of the city, which I understand has a mandate for economic development. This group's mandate is economic prosperity. But is the mandate of each of these organizations aligned with what the city wants to do? And I'm just looking at, simple, when I went down to look further, you haven't talked about it, is that the city has, you're recommending 2 votes, everybody else gets 1 vote, and then there's 2 kind of not affiliated people on the board. That is something that the city really wants to see happen. They don't have an easy way to go about that, because there's these other agencies that are now represented on the board that may not necessarily have their economic priorities aligned, and so the city may not be able to achieve through this what it wants to achieve. And I'm a bit concerned about that as these agencies nominate, or the partners nominate people to the board, and it's the board's responsibility for vetting it, how does the city's intent and intention in not only funding, but leading, hopefully providing some leadership to this initiative, get on the table?
It's a good question, and it kind of speaks to some really fundamental points, which are probably important to kind of talk about. One is first of all, everything that this agency does, and in fact, everything the city's own internal small economic development office will do, is going to be guided by the economic development strategy. So the mandate, the alignment is going to come through the strategy. So the strategy is being developed, I understand, kind of being spearheaded by this group, but being developed in a very inclusive community fashion that will identify what the community thinks is important with respect to community economic development. And the city's role in all of that is going to be to kind of bring together the community to collectively set that direction that's going to be expressed in the strategy. This agency then will take its marching orders from that strategy. when we talk about the city, does the city get what it wants with respect to what this agency does or the city's interests? That's a really fundamental question, because when we go back to the report, if the city really wanted to be able to call all the shots and have ultimate control over what was done with economic development and what and how it was operated, we would be looking at an in-house city model. And that was something that we came back from the report from the community, from the stakeholders, and said that's not something that's supported. So right away, the city accepted and council accepted that it needs to give up a certain amount of authority with respect to setting that direction. So the city has said, we entrust this group, which is representative of the community, and not only through the board but also through committees, we entrust this group, relying on the strategy which has been set by the community as well. We entrust this group to kind of follow through and act in accordance with that mandate set out in the strategy. So I think that it's the other, and in terms of the other bodies that would be represented on the board, do they have, are they there kind of pushing their interests? Are they kind of looking at the broader group's interests? One of the things that's going to be really important to emphasize as we look at the board and the role of the board and the governance role of the board is the notion of this, everybody has a fiduciary duty to that board. That group's role is to ensure that it kind of does the mandate of the board set out by the economic development strategy. So the strategy is really kind of key in all of this. Hope that answers.
That's good.
Okay. Andre?
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly back onto the dissolution discussion. I think that the city should have every right to defund. It should also have every right to disassociate with the organization, but I'm not sure about the full dissolution. I look at it as akin to, we're all playing in the same sandbox together. If the city decides to go home, should they have the right to blow up that sandbox, even if there's collaboration happening outside? So, with the massive amount of funding coming in from the city, I think they should have the right to take that back and even dissolve all those Class A sheriffs, so there's no legal tie of any sort. But the idea of dissolution doesn't sit that well.
Okay. And we have Dave.
And then Robert.
Oh, and Bob, you'll be next after Dave.
I guess my concern in this section relates to who decides how many board members there are, shareholders, and it concerns me that the city could create more Class A shareholders. If they want a majority, just create 4 or 5 more, and then they have the majority that they want at that time. And I think that those decisions should be made by all the members.
Thank you very much. And with respect to that question, we do see that the composition and method of appointment to the board of directors would be of all the members to decide. So the city under this scenario could not decide to increase the number of board members and have those as city appointees.
Okay, well, it seems to imply that they could. They're solely responsible for the inclusion of additional Class A shareholders. So that
I beg your pardon. That's for Class A shareholders. For the board, that's up to everybody. For Class A shareholders, and the distinction again, and it comes back to the fundamental point. The distinction again was Class A would be the body that kind of had certain authority that the others don't, and over borrowing, and also over dissolution of the agency. It comes. I guess one of the things, notwithstanding the fact that we always want to prepare for the worst day, and I understand that point in kind of structuring these things, but at the end of the day, the only way that this organization or that any function is going to work is if there's a certain amount of common will and trust among the players. And that's one of the things that, I hope that doesn't sound too naive given the history I know, but with the economic development strategy, that's one of the ways I think to kind of get people rallied around a particular direction. Now, with respect to the question over Class A shares, I think that's again something that we can kind of put up here to think about. If the group wants to go with the shared ownership model at all. But the Class A share bid, in terms of the city being the only one that can determine that, that's simply reflected in here because of the dissolution.
My understanding of it is that a share equals a member.
Correct.
So if you create 10 shares,
Yeah.
then you got 10 members.
Yeah.
And then if you have 10 members and the rest of us only have 5 members, then you got the majority anyway. So that's my point. You can change the composition of the board by adding members.
Well,
Solely at your own discretion.
Yes.
That's my concern.
if you created other Class A shareholders, yes, you could.
Yeah, and so the only person that decides that is the city.
For Class A shareholders.
You know, so if things are going a little sideways and I want to take more control, you know, I'm the city, I'm just going to create more shareholders that are Class A. That's mine.
Yeah,
But
that's a valid point. I think, and we can try to kind of change that to make an extra safeguard. I guess I would argue that if we are at that point where the city has lost confidence in its colleagues or its other members, and the parties aren't talking to one another, and the city kind of tries to pull a fast one by appointing 5 new Class A shareholders, the thing's kind of dead anyway. But, I mean, there's been no trust around the table, but.
I agree with that. I'm just going by the law, you know, that the only person that can get rid of the agency is the city. So the other members are being carried along.
Yes.
At that point, and they can just say, well, we're not going to participate, but technically they're members and they can't just walk away from it.
Oh, okay. So you're suggesting then that if you are a Class B member, you couldn't walk away without the permission of the others?
Well, if let's say, and I'm just saying.
Yeah, no.
This is worst case scenario, Nanaimo decides to add 10 more members.
Yep. I'm
the Class B, you know, and Nanaimo wants to approve a $4 million budget, and I can't afford the $360,000.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, they've now taken control. It used to be a 2/3, 1/3 voting, you know.
Well, I think
and now I don't have that anymore, and so now I'm not feeling that good about the situation.
Yes.
And, you know, that's my concern, right? It sets up a scenario where one member could gain control without the other members wanting it. That's my concern.
Okay, well, if that in fact is the case, then that was not the intention, so thank you for raising that, because the intention was to have a fairly high degree of shared control of this.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Okay.
Shall I go on, Madam Chair?
I believe so.
Okay.
But did Bob have a comment?
Oh, Bob.
Oh, Bob, I beg your
Sorry,
pardon. Okay.
Bob.
Thank you. I just wanted to add my support to Doug and Andre's comments about the city not having the sole power for dissolution. I do think that the whole issue of durability is key in my mind, and I think others. This organization needs to be able to carry on. And I guess that there may need to be some form of dispute resolution mechanism built into this. But I think by and large, the organizations that we're talking about as being shareholders, at the end of the day, they're all tied at the hip anyway. We're all about trying to move the city forward. But perhaps rather than we having absolute authority to dissolve the organization, maybe another mechanism we could consider is if the city no longer wants to participate, they give notice in some, maybe I'm going to say a year or 18 months notice, and then at least the rest of the participants have the opportunity to restructure the organization so they can carry on. And maybe something like that would provide a better go-forward plan, such that the organization could evolve but not be dissolved. Thanks.
And Doug.
Maybe as a helpful thought experiment working through that, we should take our previous experience and say, if we had superimposed this share structure on NEDC, the outcome we're trying is that NEDC could have survived without the city as its primary shareholder, and the subsequent shareholders, Bs or Cs, whatever they are, who were everybody who participated in the Mid-Island Business Initiative, could have stepped forward and the organization would have survived across those whatever, survive that turmoil and still allow the city to step in, step out. If the share structure can do that, then we're going to be.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. That's a good idea. Excellent. Okay, shall we move on that?
Yeah,
We're good?
I think we're good.
Good. Well, I was just going to comment too, just in response to Bob's point with respect to some kind of check-in. And Mr. Rudolph mentioned, or Jake mentioned as well, that the idea of this kind of sunset clause, like after a particular point in time, you're forced to look at it. And is it working? How do we want to change it? So maybe that's another thought too. Okay, let's move on and talk now about the decision-making body for the agency. We've dealt with the owners. Under the model we've just identified, under the scenario, we've talked about a bunch of different owners. We could simply have one owner, and that's going to be a fundamental question to kind of talk about. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But we could have one owner only, and in which case other representation and buy-in would come in other ways. And one of those ways would be through the Board of Directors. And so the Board of Directors is kind of, I think it could apply as structured here or as suggested here under either the ownership model or the sole owner model. But let's talk about the Board of Directors as we've laid it out. And I'll try to explain the thinking behind what we've got on the page here. First of all, the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency is governed by its own Board of Directors, which is comprised of 9 individuals. Chose 9 because we talked last time about wanting to have single digit, so took 9. 9 individuals appointed by the members at the corporation's annual general meeting in accordance with the following rules on composition. So what we've stated here, and we didn't really reach a conclusion or a definitive direction last time we met with respect to the city's participation on the board. So I've put in here, based on some other models, based on some other examples in other cities, I've put in representation, or the city designating the city as an owner, designating 2 individuals to serve as directors, and one of those individuals would be a city councilor and one would be a senior city staff member. I've also noted here that each of the other members or owners would designate one individual to serve as a director, and then the members together would select and appoint the remaining 2 directors from persons who apply to the board through a public call for applicants. Members are guided, so those would kind of be the at-large members, as it were. Members are guided in the appointment of all 9 directors by a skills matrix which identifies the skill sets and backgrounds that should, to the extent possible, inform the decisions of the board. Ideally, the board as a whole has persons with the following skills and experience. Now, we wrestled a little bit last time with the idea of, do we want a representative board or do we want a skills-based board? In other words, does it matter kind of who appoints or where the person comes from, or is it more important that the person possesses certain skills to do this job properly? And what my notes kind of have from our last discussion, we decided, well, let's see if we can, and maybe pick up on Jake's point earlier, maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. Let's have a bit of both, kind of a hybrid approach where we get some representation, but then within that representation, we have some skills matrix applied as well. And I think that's how it's done with the Airport Authority. If I was looking at the Airport Authority structure, I don't know if we have our Airport Authority with us.
Dave's here now.
Oh, sorry, Dave. I'm so stuck on looking at the board. Sorry, beg your pardon. Yeah, I think that's the same Dave as.
We do have, we do, it's not really firm, but we do try to identify certain skills to get on the board.
Okay.
So, and we have 3 lawyers and an accountant.
Okay. But that's
Very conservative.
But that's also, though, the individuals are appointed or nominated at least by different groups in town, right?
They are, yeah.
Okay. So you've kind of tried to kind of get a bit of both in there. Okay, I'll just go on and then we can pause and talk a little bit about the Board of Directors. We got Ian here.
Ian?
Oh, get on mute.
I'll wait till we pause it.
Okay. Okay, so one of the things that we talked about last day was having more than a 1-year term. So I've kind of put in, for the purpose of discussion, a 2-year term here, and we've talked also about having something staggered so that there's some continuity in the board. So we've tried to establish that. Now, some of the kind of the nuts and bolts on kind of how exactly it works, I've kind of tried to lay out to the best at this point, but there'll need to be some thought to kind of the mechanics of it all. But the gist is that we have a staggered appointment process, and that we have 2-year terms with a maximum of 6 years in total, so 3 2-year terms. The board of directors, we talk about the chair and the vice chair, and that one's fairly straightforward, I think. The board members themselves would elect a chair and a vice chair. And the remuneration, this would be a volunteer board with expenses paid, those kinds of things. Board of Directors decisions, this one's kind of key. So the Board of Directors is an autonomous decision-making body appointed to direct and oversee the activities of the Prosperity Agency. The board is empowered to make a broad range of decisions, including those related to the annual financial plan. So as a separate corporation, this body then would set its own plan, its own financial plan. Now, I would guess that this would be a multi-year plan in the same way municipalities set 5-year financial plans, because we want to ensure that there's some kind of look beyond the first year. The economic development strategy for Nanaimo. So again, this body was initially struck with the idea of creating that strategy. The task force has taken on that role. So now we're looking more at kind of updating, maintaining it, and so forth. The hiring of the executive director for the agency, empowering and holding to account the agency's executive director, the approval of other staff positions, entering into agreements and contracts and terminating such agreements and contracts. Again, one of the fundamental differences between this body and a committee, for example, is this would be a corporate body with the authority to enter into contracts. Appointing an independent auditor to prepare the agency's annual financial statements. That was the question that came up last time. Do we need to have a separation there? And I was advised in my discussions post our last meeting that yes, we would need to. And then finally, the creation and appointment of members to board advisory committees. All directors vote on all decisions of the board. Each director, including the chair, holds one vote. Decisions in favor of the resolution require a straight majority of directors present. So we've tried to make very kind of equal. Nobody kind of gets more say than the others, although the city would have 2 appointees, so if we kind of think in those terms. But again, the idea, the hope that decisions would be made largely by consensus. Where that weren't the case, we would resort to voting. A key point then when we look at committees. So one of the mechanisms, we've looked at 2 mechanisms so far for making this agency inclusive. One is share ownership, and again, that's a big question mark because we've only looked at one option. We could have one sole share owner, but we've looked at share ownership as one mechanism, and we've also looked at board membership as another mechanism. A third mechanism for making it inclusive and getting that buy-in is through committees. So the board would strike and rely on committees to do a number of different things. Really to assist in implementing the economic development strategies, to provide advice on new and ongoing initiatives, and to engage, to engage the broader community. So really the purpose is to engage the broader community, would provide advice to the board. The choice of committees is informed by the economic development strategy. So whatever it comes out of the strategy in terms of the focus areas, presumably the board then would want to look at committees to give advice in those areas. Excuse me. And so informed by the economic development strategy, opportunities or issues that arise. So there may be some short-term committees that are struck to kind of deal with emergent issues that arise, and also requests that are made by different sectors of the community. And then we've noted here that all committee members are appointed by the board as a whole. So this is a decision of the board, not of the shareholders, of the board. And the board as a whole appoints a chair and vice chair for each committee. And I'll just mention finally, and then we'll pause and discuss the board, just with respect to reporting. So one of the key success factors we talked about was accountability. So we've listed it here as reporting, and talked about the board being accountable to the members, the shareholders that is, for the operation and performance of the Nanaimo Prosperity Agency. Accountability is achieved through presentation to the members and to the public of annual financial statements, presentation to the members and the public of an annual report that does 3 things. 1, provides information on the initiatives and efforts over the previous year. 2, assesses the agency's performance over the past year using progress measures that themselves would be created based on the economic development strategy, on how to measure success against that strategy. And then 3, sets out important initiatives and events that are planned for the upcoming year as per the economic development strategy. So again, the central importance of that economic development strategy there. Other mechanisms for accountability then, other reporting would be presentations to the members at the agency's annual general meeting, semi-annual briefings to each member, and other means, formal and informal, that the members may request. That section was really informed by my discussions with Calgary Economic Development and what they kind of undertake to ensure that their member, their shareholder, their owner, which in this case, in their case is the City of Calgary, is kept in the loop, there's accountability back to the city and so forth. Madam Chair, I'll stop there and we can discuss board.
Does anybody have any questions? Okay, I've got Kathy, I've got Andre, I've got Ian. Kathy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going back up to the, let me just go back up here, the composition. This is, you've got from the City of Nanaimo two directors. One is a council member and the other is a senior staff member. I'm just curious of why a councillor would be a voting member and not ex officio. And does by having a council member on as a director, does that politicize the board? Or is it better to have them as an ex officio so they can go back and report to council about the activities in an ex officio manner?
Thank you very much, and through the chair, if I may, that's a very good question, and it's kind of, for me, it's a bit of an open question, and so I look to the task force for direction on that. It is, for want of a more persuasive argument, my main reason for putting that was just looking at some other structures of other corporations as opposed to committees or opposed to commissions and so forth that actually assign a full membership role to a member of council. But I think you're quite right, Kathy, in that the main purpose there is to ensure that there's a city presence there, but also a link back to the city. So if we are comfortable with saying we can keep that link back to the city strong through other mechanisms, perhaps then there's not a need to have a council member on the board. I will mention there was one more reason why we thought it was important, and this kind of came out in our consultations for the report, why we thought it was important to have city people on the board, what council member and a senior staff member. That was not only to kind of ensure that there was a good connection in terms of content and subject area and information back and forth between the two corporations, the city corporation and the agency, but also to ensure that the city, simply by assigning a senior staff member, for example, a city manager and a councillor, really was demonstrating through those appointments strong confidence in and a commitment to this agency.
And I would agree with the assigning the senior staff member because they're the ones responsible for running the business of the city. I just think that there's a conflict opportunity with the elected official, and with that, as an ex officio member, not a voting member of the board, they can still communicate. And then the city could appoint someone else, whether it's a member of the community that they have confidence in or another senior staff member to the board, like you could have the director of finance as well as the CAO or whatever combination. I just think that I wouldn't want to put council in a position where their fiduciary duties to council and the fiduciary duties to this committee would create a conflict. And I don't know if on other committees that council sits on, whether they can be voting members on those committees other than standing, committees in the community. So that's just my comment there. The other one I had is on the committee structure. I would, within the Constitution or this charter here, suggest that there be two committees. There can be many more, of course. But one would be governance, which takes care of the business of the board and how the board operates and nominations and policy manuals, yada, yada, and recommends those to come forward. And then the other one being the finance committee, which then develops the budget with staff, but brings that forward to the board. And then there can be however other many committees. But those two take care of, I think, fundamental business of the board that might be helpful to be engraved in this document.
Excellent point.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy. I have Andre.
My comment is that if we're looking to build up a scale matrix, having two members at large might be a little limited. It's great that we have the members, and it's unknown in the exact number of members, but I would encourage there to be a little bit more in the community at large. Something like 4 is a more appropriate number, because when you're looking to carte blanche to pick somebody. So I would encourage, even if it brings the board size a little larger, I think it's important to have that more community members.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Ian?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I guess I'm along the same lines as Kathy. I think if you have an elected official in there, you might have a conflict, might have a little problem with that. I think one staff city member would be sufficient in relation to the 9 individuals that would be on the board of directors. The other thing is, I mean, obviously you're looking for people on your board, and you have that skill assessment, you have that skill matrix, and you try to fill it. But I also think we should be looking at the individuals based on the focus groups and bringing people from each one of those categories into the board, as opposed to, you know, somebody with a finance background, somebody with a legal background, etc. I think we're talking about economic development, and the focus groups dealt with those groups that were related to economic and development of business in the city. So I think that's where you take your groups from. How they get nominated might be a little different issue on that. And as far as the committees go, I think, yeah, the committees of the board should be committees that deal with the operation of the board and the entity. And I think in reading this sort of the document here, that they assist in the broader community aspect. I think that should be the actual staff and the CEO of the organization that should be doing that, and not involve the board members at that point. And I have to run out for a 2:30 here, so I'll just add one more thing. I think in your executive director position, I think we really need to have that individual develop as well as advise on the implementation and maintenance of the economic development strategy, because I think you want to hire an individual that has done this or is very familiar with this and knows what they're doing and can steer the board, if you will, through what it wants it to do. So I think that is very key in moving forward with this. And I think some of the duties in there are a little pedantic for somebody that you want to join and make economic development creator. Those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, hi, Dave.
Just related to these skill sets, what I've seen before is for the at-large membership, that sometimes you're looking for a very specific set of skills, but you don't normally dictate to the entity, you know, who they're going to put on there. And so I think I would narrow these skill sets, you know, to maybe development, community development, things like that. But I don't really think if I was, you know, the executive director, I wouldn't want to be directed on HR matters by the board, you know, because I would think that would be in my area. And then back to board decision making. Again, I wonder why the board would be approving other staff positions. I believe they'd be approving the budget, but I don't think they should be approving the hiring of those positions. And then I also wonder why they would be involved in entering into agreements. Again, I think that's the executive director's role in accordance with the budget.
Okay. Well, thank you. Just on those very good points, just on those last two points, I think the ideal, my thinking was not to kind of approve the hiring of an individual, but approve the creation of a position that they would have budgetary implications. But as you quite rightly say, Dave, that they're going to deal with that through budget.
Yeah, I just think you need to say it.
Yeah, so maybe it's a little bit redundant.
You know, just say approve the budget for other positions. But the way I read it, it implies the hiring.
No, a good point. And then I beg your pardon, your last point was...
I don't think the board should be involved in entering into agreements. They already get to decide policy. You know, so we're going to have a policy. Every contract's over this amount will get tendered. I don't think that board should...
Okay. So maybe I need to clarify that then. I think the intent was the board as the corporate body will have to sign certain things, but it'll be on the recommendation of the executive director. and then the legal signature, and the executive director may have authority to sign certain things as well.
Yeah, and based on policy, that's already been approved by the board.
Okay.
So that's just a clarity item.
Okay. Oh, I got Jim. Councillor Jim.
Thank you. I think I'm unmuted. So the only question I have, and it may be a minor point, which is maybe why it's not here, and that is I don't see any reference to, for meetings, the quorum that would be required.
Very good point. Thank you. Yeah, and that is an omission. So it was certainly we'll kind of put that in there. I think that would probably come in under board policies and governance policies, but we'll certainly kind of add that here.
I just want to throw out one more thing. I don't know if it was considered, but one of the more successful development corporations was the Surrey Development Corporation, and apparently they've been dissolved into the city. But they were allocated lands to develop. And I don't know if we ever considered whether the corporation should be the catalyst to develop, city lands. So I'm just bringing it up.
It's a very good question, and what I can offer, and maybe I'll defer to Councilor Martman as well on that if you wish. But what I can offer on that is a couple of things. First of all, in Surrey right now, there is the Surrey Land Development Corporation, which has it hasn't replaced the Development Corporation, but I believe that corporation does exist still. And so just to do exactly what you say to develop those lands. The other thing then, with respect to the role of the potential agency of Nanaimo to be active in that kind of investment scenario, I think, one of the potential items that was on the list of services or within the scope of services that the agency could do would be to run an Nanaimo investment fund, which would be a large fund. Other places have, VIU has one, City of Calgary has one, that kind of thing. Calgary has assigned authority over to that to actually a separate corporation, but it kind of comes under the City of Calgary Economic Development.
Yeah, they got 100 billion or something.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah. So that was looked at, and what council came back with very clearly was that's not a bad idea, but not right now. Let's look at that 5 years from now. So I suspect, and I know that's different from what you're suggesting, but I suspect council would probably take the same approach in that, okay, let's look at that in 5 years once we've got our feet under us.
It dramatically increased people's interest in being on the committee.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a lot we could talk about on that, but I agree with Alan. The two-step would be kind of a preferable appropriate way to go. I was involved in the establishment of that corporation. This was a fundamental issue, and in both times, the land piece was left off with the prospect of sometime adding it in. Get it going, see how it works, but it was not, and I'm familiar with the Surrey one. I'm surprised to hear that they're down, because they ran the industrial park and downtown Wally, if you want to call it that, it was all part of their mandate.
Just on the board membership, I like the idea of appointing non-political, and no offense, but just the staff. I used to be in local government. Staff are in a political hot spot as well.
Yeah.
Right. So you just have to who you put on the board. I think.
Okay. Very helpful. Thank you.
I think. Oh, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just maybe it's a question. If these agents or groups are going to assign a person to the board, and then the board approves that person to be on the board, it doesn't have to be a staff member of that organization. It could be anybody who they feel is qualified to be their representative. But how does the board then make recommendations back to its owners? So is there a mechanism in this how does that flow through the other way work? The owners can say, okay, we want you to focus on this and focus on that based on what their interests are. But is there some kind of way of going backwards? So if the board really thinks having an industrial land bank in the city is a great idea, how does that get back to the city?
very good question. Yeah, so, and just on the first comment, you're absolutely right that the person appointed by or nominated by a particular owner does not have to be within that owner's structure. So I think we have, again, on the airport, I think Dave Woody, for example, is the Chamber's appointee, isn't he, or nomination? And
Good question.
there we go, yes. Yeah.
I know he's there.
So anyway, so that's one question. You're absolutely right. The second then, with respect to recommendations back, there's two parts to that. First, I think it's really important to recognize, again, we go back to, and I think you understand this, so I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but this very much is an independent body. And so it doesn't really make recommendations in the sense that committee would make recommendations to council, that kind of thing. So it is, but then the question is kind of suggestions to council that we should expand the mandate to take on the land development role, that kind of thing. How does it do that? Well, the board as a whole would do that, and possibly through the chair and the executive director on reporting, coming to report to council, or having the annual general meeting with the different members. So there's different mechanisms through the reporting. Some are informal, but there's also lots of formal ones, the AGM, the annual report, all those kinds of things, the briefings to council, the briefings to the other members, where there's an opportunity to kind of take ideas back to the members that the members ultimately have to make a decision on. So maybe we just need to be clearer about that in what we've written to make that crystal clear.
And then, Alan, is there an assumption here that each of the owners would have the the chair and the CAO or CEO report back to them individually, or is that just up for grabs depending on who wants to do what?
So there's not an assumption of that, and in fact it was, yeah, so really this board then, as an independent body, people sitting on that board have a fiduciary responsibility to that body. And so the connection back to the board would likely happen if it were, back to the owners would happen from the board as a whole through the chair. So, or the board of a whole, yeah, so there wouldn't be kind of Jim on kind of representing the Port Authority would not kind of, it's not his job to go back and brief the Port Authority. That's going to be the board as a whole is going to keep them briefed.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's really through the AGM that would report the business of the activities of the board, the past, and then what their future is going to unfold. Okay.
The AGM's a big one, but there's also, we've identified kind of semi-annual briefings to the owners. In speaking with Calgary Economic Development, one of the questions I had, and this is very apropos, Kathy, to your points, one of the questions I have was how does the board ensure that the owners are kind of in the loop and supportive? And he was saying, look, he goes, we have quarterly meetings with council. We have, at the executive level, that is the staff level, we have quarterly presentations to the mayor's office, because in that case, it's just the city that owns. And he outlined all these different mechanisms, formal and informal, to make sure that they're all kind of lockstep.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the business of the board working it out with the owners as to what's the best way.
Yes.
I would suggest quarterly would be way too much. That's a lot of reports and a lot of meetings.
I agree, and that's why I put in semi-annual instead, so, yes.
Okay, I think, I've got Andre.
Yeah, quickly, the independence of having the people from City Hall, both city councilors and staff in the room, the pendulum in different organizations has swung in both directions. I think we were probably guilty in the last incarnation of the NABC of being too far separated from council. I mean, we tried, but the reality is that we were playing games of telephone, that our messaging was getting directly to council. So I do think it's important to have a direct relationship, at least in the between our board and council, somebody in those council meetings that can speak on our behalf. So whether or not they're voting or not, less important. Them being in the room is very important.
Thank you, Andre.
Alan, my experience has been no voting members from council, maybe not even a member of council on these boards. Usually a member of staff, not always a voting member. But to me, it's important to have a liaison, but the complications that get involved when the elected official is listening to the pitch that's come from the meeting they participated in voting on, it's a bit of a challenge, so it puts them in a spot. So I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I think the objective of communication is important, and it's both parties in a bit of an awkward spot, so I'm not sure. I definitely would suggest maybe not the elected official at all, but and the staff person, I'm on the fence about voting or not, to be honest. Sure.
Yeah, I'm getting the sense, I've kept a running list of people who have spoken to this. I'm certainly getting the sense that voting member council is not on. Okay, yeah, lots of nods. All right. Okay, woo, we got a definitive rule there. Okay. Okay, I will just address one other major item here and then one smaller one, but the major item is with respect to funding. Now, this one is kind of put out here as the whole document is for the purpose of discussion, but the idea here behind this was that a couple of principles, I guess, or a couple of ideas. One is that the city provides the bulk of the base funding. So keep the lights on, keep the staff going, keep the basics going in terms of marketing and all those kinds of roles. We need to have secure base funding, and the city is primarily responsible for that. The other then is that when it comes to specific projects or initiatives, those represent opportunities to involve others and to bring others to the table with skin in the game, as it were. And that's a model that has been very successful in other jurisdictions too. So what I've suggested here, for the sake of discussion again, is that we have kind of base funding and project funding. Base funding provided by the members in accordance with this formula. The city provides 85%, the other members together provide 15%. So that's 15% divided by what we've arbitrarily said here are 5 members, not a lot, but it is kind of there at the table. And that doesn't also preclude those other members from participating in projects as well. And then I've just noted base funding is really kind of intended to cover the basics. And I've listed some in there. It's not a definitive list. We can kind of quibble over that, but I suspect it's going to be a list that the board and that we'll kind of refine as we go along. But it's in essence kind of enough to make sure that it can kind of operate and do good stuff in kind of without having to kind of get out there and chase grant money all the time to take care of the basic administration. The second then is project funding, in part by members through their investment in base funding. So the idea that we would put some of that investment into projects. So for example, destination marketing, that kind of, or not destination marketing, but marketing or business attraction, those kinds of things. And in part by private businesses, governments, and public agencies in the form of conditional initiative-related grants. The idea of project grants, the idea of project funding. When we look at a place like the city of Calgary, and again, it's just an example, there are others that follow this model as well, they have what's called Team Calgary. And Team Calgary kind of is a framework through which different agencies in the city of Calgary, or that have a presence in the city of Calgary, different agencies, mostly private but some public as well, will contribute funding to Calgary economic development that is earmarked in most cases for different initiatives. And so when we look at Calgary economic development, its budget is about $12 million a year, $13 million a year. The Team Calgary members will give about $1.5 million of that, just in terms of their annual contributions to those different projects that go on. So that is another mechanism, by the way, that can be done instead of ownership or in combination with ownership. So we've got yet another mechanism on kind of getting people bought in both figuratively and literally. So that is kind of the funding model there. And then we look at executive director, the idea then of having one chief staff person. And Ian's made some good points with respect to kind of fleshing out a little bit of the stuff there and maybe reworking some of those ideas. Operations, we've noted that it would be, the body would have its own office space outside of City Hall. I've suggested arbitrarily downtown Nanaimo. And that while it would be responsible for providing its core services, like corporate services in terms of its financial management, accounting, legal, all those kinds of things, it would make sense for them to contract that to the city wherever possible because it would be more effective. That was something that came out in our last discussion in February. Okay, Madam Chair, I'll stop there and we can... Yes.
Okay, so do I have any further questions?
I have a question about funding. So my question is, how independent is the board really? When there's a budget and it gets approved by the board, does that mandate that the members contribute their, ours would be 3%? Or is there or does the more public process of the city, trump that, and they don't have to approve the 85%, they can send it back to the board for reconsideration?
Right. Well, it is, I suppose the independence is ultimately going to be kind of the proof of the pudding. Council, under this model, and really kind of under any model we can conceive of, council, at the end of the day, if council wanted to, could kill the whole thing. Or could back out and leave the sandbox, but not take its toys, as it were. So it could back out. I think that and maybe a different way of putting that is there's really no model we could develop that would preclude that or prevent that possibility. What we are trying to do, notwithstanding the idea of preparing for the worst day, what we are trying to do is put in place a model that, at least with the proper interests at the table and with kind of the community interests represented, that creates a framework for independent decisions to be made away from the council table, and for secure budgeting or secure finances to be provided by council. So if we had a 3 to 5 year operating budget, for example, or financial plan, we would know that, okay, council then has kind of has through its financial planning process as well, where it would identify its annual contributions, it has identified that it is going to keep supporting this agency. Now, can council come back through an amendment to its financial plan bylaw and change that? Yes, and we can't stop that. So it's a little bit of a I'm not going to say a leap of faith, because if it were just a leap of faith, we probably wouldn't be at this point now. It's a little bit of a path forward that anticipates and assumes a certain amount of wanting this to work.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a good idea too. But I just, I'm not even Nanaimo, but if, my organization right now, we have 500,000 passengers a year coming in January.
Yep.
And then by March, we're thinking it's going to be less than 200,000. And so, something's gone wrong in the travel industry. So for us, a 3%, right now would be a serious amount of money.
Yeah, sure.
In a normal year would be probably not.
Yeah.
And so if, let's say, my board says, we can't afford it, we're not giving our 3%. What happens at that point is my question. Are we legally bound to pay it because I'm in the corporation, I'm a member, I've agreed to be a member, I've signed a piece of paper. I'm just wondering.
So in that scenario, I would suspect what would happen, particularly around a pandemic. I mean, if it were, oh man, traffic's down 5%, we're counting our pennies, we don't think we're going to pay. Then I think the other members would say, well, you're kind of in or you're out. Is this a priority or is it not? It's not a big investment. But if it were a pandemic year, like the one we've had now, where the sky has fallen, and no pun intended with the airport, but the sky has fallen, we in that case, then I would think what would happen is the members would come together in a special member meeting, which the bylaws would allow for because it's in the Business Corporations Act, and say, look, there is severe kind of economic stress on 5 of these 6 members. We need to redo how we're going to do our financing this year, or funding this year. And one would hope that there would be some understanding on the part of the different members on how to make that work. If one member decided then, like, I just can't do it, then we're going to back out, then they back out. I mean, at the end of the day, we're dealing with independent corporations that can choose or not to choose to continue to be shareholders. Under this model, the shareholder model. Now, if it were just the city as the shareholder, that would be a less of an issue. Then the city would be saying, or then the corporation would be saying, the agency would be saying to, let's say, the airport authority. Let's say the airport authority had put in $50,000 or $25,000 into a special initiative that was good for the economic development of the community, which by extension is good for the airport. And you were one of several funders, and you said we can't do it this year. Then, depending on the contracts that were signed and the forgiveness of the beneficiaries, I guess that would then determine that. So.
It's just, I guess it leads me to believe that the best model, or a model that I think would work well, is would be the city owns the whole thing, 100%, that they invite entities to be on the board, and that the entities agree through a separate agreement to provide 15% of the money. But it's, because really the city's got the control. Ultimately, why don't they just keep it? And then we really are working in a more collaborative process.
In response to that, at the beginning of putting together the task force, that was one of the models that was presented to us. I believe it was a majority of this committee, and maybe Bill, you can speak, that actually wanted the hybrid, or...
Yeah, certainly, and Al kind of touched at the beginning, right? So,
Yeah.
I understand Dave's point as well.
Right.
I think there's a couple options here, and I think, Alan, you're going to discuss the next option as well.
And then just one other thing, because I understand that councils can change in 2 years. You could have a whole different council. So is there a structure, when you were talking of a 5-year contract, that a new council would not be able to dismantle?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not a lawyer, but I guess from a broader perspective, councils do have quite a bit of authority on what business the city chooses to do or not do. Now, they are tied into legal contracts that extend beyond council terms. So if you have a public-private partnership and you're committed to paying $1 million a year into the partnership, and you're there for 20 years, that's something you're stuck with. It's a good question. I don't know
Just
the answer.
thinking of security, or,
I think we're really close to the answer through the conversation today. So Andre has given us the clue that the major shareholder should has to maintain the right to be able to defund. But the point of the hybrid is that they can't crash the whole thing.
No,
they can step back, but the thing is, and I think, Dave, the answer to your question is hidden in there too, because somehow that Class B share is the agreement to fund is not related to Class B ownership. It's related to a separate contribution agreement, so that it's it is, in lots of ways more discretionary. It's not built into the structure of the share, to the rights that are bound up in that share, in that Class B share.
okay. Oh, Kathy?
Just a comment, thank you. Oh, am I? Yeah, I'm
No,
unmuted.
Kathy first, then Andre.
Well, I'm having to step back. Okay, just 2 comments on, I would presume, and this is, I guess, for the consultant to comment on, that there would be a formal agreement between any of these funders and the agency on the length of the deal, how often what's to happen, and what would be the contribution agreement between the parties that are giving money. Similarly, if you get a grant, there's always some kind of agreement and accountabilities within that. So if it's different than that, that would be part of the workings of the staff to be doing those, approved by the board, I think. But my other question was, in the what the duties were, what the funding model was, you had that there would be an amount designated for destination marketing. Was there a presumption that any of the MRDDT funding, which is directed for destination marketing, would come into this? And would that be a part of the budget that would come from the city? Because that funding does go to the city, and the city then gives it to an agency for destination marketing. Have you thought that far along yet?
Maybe I can address that, and just by first of all apologizing that was a misuse of the term, and that was my fault. I put that I'm talking marketing, kind of business marketing, attracting businesses, new investment. Destination marketing, you're quite right, Kathy, has a very specific significance, kind of capital D, capital M, which refers to the municipal regional district hotel
Okay.
tax. So I beg your pardon, that's separate. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And about contribution agreements, that there would be agreements spelled out between the funders or the owners and the agency that would spell out the terms and conditions of the money coming to them, how long it would come, when the agreement would be renewed, what would be any terms or conditions within that.
Yes, we would. Yeah, no, it's a very good point, because we would want this charter kind of gives us, it puts some flesh on the bones, and it kind of says what we're trying to achieve. But you're quite right. The mechanisms for kind of making sure everything's in place, then we're going to need kind of the articles of incorporation. We're also going to need then agreements around the funding and around specific initiative funding.
Thank you. And Andre?
Great. And I'm okay with just about any funding model that works. It's up to the parties to decide what works. And so, who's doing that work? Who's going to have the discussion with each of these members about what the appropriate contribution is? And I mean, with Kathy there has to be a fixed term. We need a 5-year certainty from any sort of agreement. So, my inclination is to leave this area fairly loose in the charter for now until agreements can be met, because this could get right off the bat if we can't get any funding from these members. So, and with council funded under a guise where they were 100%, I'm not sure, but I think that probably the work to discuss that needs to happen now, and that we wouldn't want to go anywhere public until we get buy-in from those members.
Right. Good point.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, thank you. If I may then, and Andre, that's a really good point, and it does kind of bring us to a fundamental question, I think, which we've talked about earlier already, but I'll just pose it to the group maybe, because it will kind of address a number of our other questions that we've raised today. I wonder if the task force can give me your sense, is it important to have more than one owner? We already know that it's important to have inclusion on the board, on the decision-making body. We know that it's important to have buy-in, investment in the agency. It doesn't have to be from an owner. It can be on specific projects and so forth, which maybe Andre right away gets around the concern you just raised. But maybe I can just put to the task force through the chair, Madam Chair, is it important to have more than one owner? Or conversely, should this be a city-owned, wholly city-owned agency that finds other mechanisms to bring in different groups?
Can we do a show of hands before we start a conversation, perhaps? Just saying who is interested in having more than one owner? Bob is, Andre is, Doug? So the rest of you, I will assume you're not interested in?
How could abstentions?
Who am I missing?
Oh,
Jason?
Jason has texted us something, I think. He sent a note to us.
Oh, okay. Is Jason for it or against?
I think it's probably...
Well, my issue is it's not a question of whether I'm for it or against it. You're asking, is it important?
Is important.
And I say it's not important to have more than one owner. I'm not opposed to having more than one owner, but I don't think it's important. And I feel like what we're saying by having these little sub-agreements, that it's not a real corporation. Like if the airport signs on as an owner, it's obligated as an owner to follow the voting structure and anything that comes out of it. But what we're saying is, well, no, it's not really like that. You'll have a side agreement that lets you off the hook as an owner, and you may not have to pay or you may have to pay. And so to me, it becomes gray whether it's really a corporation. To me, it sounds like an arrangement. And I don't understand why we need all the legalities if we're not really going to act like a corporation. So that's my problem. And so I don't think... what I'm hearing, it doesn't sound like it's an ownership structure. It sounds like a partnership.
So maybe so that's kind of comparing it to the airport authority. Maybe think about the Port Authority. So the Port Authority is wholly owned by the federal government, but the Port Authority is a separate corporation that makes a lot of decisions on its own. The feds at any time, as the owner, could change the rules of the game. But for all intents and purposes, Nanaimo Port Authority, in the same way that Vancouver Port Authority or whatever it's called these days and everything else, they are separate corporations owned by a different entity, but separate corporations that act as separate corporations with full authority to do so. This body would be like that. It would have full authority to make decisions and to do things on its own. The ownership bit is simply, is this corporation ultimately owned by just one shareholder or more than one shareholder? And I think that really the reason we put in more than one shareholder in this model, in the suggested or the scenario, was simply to reflect what was heard in the consultation for the report and what we talked about in the last meeting a little bit, that that the community felt, that the key stakeholders felt it was important to have more than one owner at the table, because it allowed for a greater level of buy-in, both figuratively and literally, but figuratively in particular.
Yeah, I got you. Thank you. Andre?
Yeah, so I think the intent of multiple owners is still correct. Logistics may not be possible. So fundamentally, already we've heard maybe that some of the members may not be interested in ownership, and if that's the case, then we have to respect that and move on. I actually don't think it was necessarily to get buy-in that we wanted from there. It was to avoid the catastrophe we saw a few years back, where one group coming called to dissolve that. And under this current structure, we're no different. If the city wants to dissolve it, then it's absolutely in their mandate currently. If we move, the reason to have multiple owners is so it is in a situation where the city could take back their funding and allow for the corporation to exist independently. That's, I think, the motivation why we were talking about multiple owners, that if either the owners who still want it, or the city is not comfortable with not having that dissolution, then there's no point in it.
Thank you. You're muted.
Thank you. So again, I would completely agree with Andre's comment that the reason for the multiple owner model was to avoid what we've experienced in the past. But adding to that, I think in my mind, what we were trying to create was a starting point that could grow. And it's quite conceivable that this organization could grow, be a bit more regional, and maybe those other owners might be Ladysmith, it could be Parksville or Qualicum that contribute to this organization, because ultimately economic development, as was said earlier, is more of a regional situation. So I think, in my mind, thinking was let's start relatively small, and hence the selection of owners that I think Alan has presented. But I mean, I think we should build a model that can be expanded going forward. And I really, from my point of view, absolutely need to build something that cannot be taken apart as NBC was. I mean, we've lost years of useful time just because of that. I would speak strongly in favor of a multi-shareholder model.
Thank you. And Jim?
I'm not tied to one or the other specifically, although I can see advantages to multiple owners. The only challenge I see is, and I'm only speaking for my perception on this, is that when the proposition of a hybrid model was presented to council, it was presented as a city-owned hybrid model, and I'm not sure what everybody understood as the definition of city-owned. In other words, did we all understand ownership could be broad spread, multiple owners, or was it specifically the city? That may be a hurdle. I'm hoping it wouldn't be, but something we need to be aware of. Thank you.
Okay. I think that
Well, Madam Chair, I look now to the committee to, we identified a number of different issues just over the course of the discussion. One was ownership, and we've got some good views on that and had some good discussion on that. One was kind of related to that, the dissolution and kind of how we need to protect against one party being able to dissolve the agency. We talked a little bit about the need for a dispute resolution mechanism. We talked about the need for kind of a 5-year sunset clause, if you will. Is that true?
3 to 5.
3 to 5. When you retire?
5 to 7.
3 to 5. And then we've got some other notes in here. I think there do seem to be kind of a series of next steps that are possible coming out of this. I'm always a little hesitant to kind of be too presumptuous going forward with staff kind of watching on as I chart out next steps. but I wonder, Madam Chair, I think my sense is, and I'll just throw this out there, that there may be some value in taking the feedback from the task force today, reworking the documents a little bit, coming back with the questions answered, and putting it in front of the committee again in a fairly short order. I know we had COVID, which put everything on hold, but if we can come back in fairly short order and move this thing along, that would be my sense. But again, that's me as the outsider.
And if the committee is, or the task force is agreeable to that, one suggestion, if you're coming back and redrafting the draft, could we have in red what was different?
Yeah.
Right? Because I find that much easier to review and go, oh yeah, that was the old one, this is new, what it's saying.
So kind of redline it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I am, because you might take my comments to be negative, but I'm in favor of an independent corporation. The makeup and how it functions, I think, is important, but I am in favor of it, of having one versus just, embedding it in, in a staff role. I think it's important that there is more broad participation in a corporation.
We talk about the exit clause, and that's the negative side of this. To me, everybody wants some certainty for a period of time. You have an active strategy for 3 to 5 years. Can we not get an agreement that this, for the purposes of 3 to 4, or pick a number, let's say 5 years, we are entering into the spirit of this agreement for making a commitment. Now, things happen, but that is how we start.
The intent.
These things, we've all seen this. It wasn't only in every place goes up and down with this whole cycle of activity. Great models get blown up, all just because things change. And so, but you need a commitment, because how are you going to attract the CEO? How are you going to get traction and implement? These things will take a little while. So I think we need a commitment, and then some malleability around that, and then some way of reviewing and exiting at the end of that, or reviewing or updating or refreshing it. So, but as a minimum, we need a commitment. This is how we're going to try to play in the sandbox, and everybody's swimming in the same direction. And this is the Team Nanaimo version, which is, this was the, if you have more players adding their value to the equation and moving the dial in their own way further, not only at this board table, but all the other agencies, it's much more powerful.
Absolutely.
Dave.
Do you have a sense of how much money that the corporation needs to run?
That is going to depend entirely on the economic development strategy. We do know that the corporation, well, Bill, you would know this better than I would just off the cuff, the money that was being spent under NEDC, I know included tourism, but just the economic development part, was it 600 or something?
Between 600 to 700.
600 to 700, okay. Yeah.
Including tourism.
No, that was separate.
It was 1.3 with tourism.
Yeah.
But then, of course, you have duplication of administration and stuff like that, so it's...
And we already have how much earmarked internally?
For next year? For this year, we earmarked 300 externally, and then the manager position internally, plus our current operating costs. So we're at about 550 right now. So the idea is to increase the investment.
I think it's very important that you healthy amount of money,
Yeah.
right? If you want to have any success. That's,
And Doug?
I like the idea of getting back to it quickly while it's still fresh in our minds. Starting at the end point, if it does end up being a multi-stakeholder thing, we probably need to make sure that the people who are on the list are aware that they're on the list, and that's not a criticism, but just
No, I understand completely.
for us all to lend our support, which we should probably ask for that to happen. And I guess there probably is we need to double down on the conversation somehow as a task force about whether it does appear to me to be simpler to have a single owner. It does meet the need of certainty if that comes with a commitment. So I can see a pathway through there, but I'm not sure that's, well, in fact, we know that's not commonly run that as a task force.
Right.
And so we probably have to give the consultants some feedback on that point somehow before the next draft is finalized.
Do you have any? Yes.
Sorry, Madam Chair, just in terms of participating towards next steps, is if this document, and Alan takes this back and fleshes it out based on commentary, and then maybe the areas that you need some additional direction from the task force, i.e. do you want 4 members at large or 2, just to highlight those, and then the task force can provide direction and a vote on majority about how to move, what those solutions would be, and then you can get that direction and move it forward to council.
No, thanks.
Is there anyone, Andre?
I do have one question in terms of mandate right at the first page there. Has that mandate been worked out as to, is the organization doing all that, or is some of that held by Emirates and the in-house team? Because when I look at like point 3, to develop and directly undertake initiatives aimed at attracting businesses, who's doing the expansion retention type of work? Is that purposely carved out, or is that something that was missed, or is it just that we haven't kind of worked out who's doing the money?
Yeah, so Andre, from my perspective, I was thinking the strategy, we'll get the strategy in place, find out where our priorities are, and then we'll divvy up the tasks appropriately.
Okay, well then, maybe for now, I might recommend in the mandate, instead of just attracting businesses, you include retaining and expanding them.
Okay.
Is there anybody else who would like to add anything? Seeing none, I'll ask for somebody to move for adjournment. So moved by Doug, seconded by Dave. All those in favor? Meeting is adjourned. It's okay. How long have you been here in the lines?
is it this time or the first time?
Well, either time.
I lived here, I lived here 20 years ago for about 4 years, and I moved away and I worked down in Valley. Yeah.
Oh, so you went that far away?
No, I was in North County,
Oh.
so I know the area pretty well.
Oh, okay, so you do know the history.
I know quite a bit of it.
You know Nanaimo.